Ladies and gentlemen, the first session will begin in 5 minutes. Please start making your way to the auditorium. Ladies and gentlemen, the first session will begin now. Please start.
Mesdames, Messieurs, nous allons commencer sous peu. Merci d'arriver et de vous installer dans la salle. Le canal 2 pour la traduction vers le français, le canal 1 vers l'anglais.
Ladies and gentlemen, the session will begin now. Please make your way to the auditorium. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome.
Mesdames, Messieurs, bienvenue à la troisième journée du Forum des marchés émergents, une conférence organisée par le EMF et le Policy Center for the New South. C'est dans le cadre du thème amélioration de gouvernance pour traiter la fragmentation globale que se tient la réunion d'aujourd'hui. Nous allons entamer nos travaux par un dialogue de ce qui est nécessaire obligatoire pour l'Inde pour devenir une économie à croissance rapide. Merci d'accueillir Harinder Kohli, directeur fondateur et PDG du Emerging Markets Forum, et Ahluwalia, ancien président adjoint. Harinder Kohli, à vous la parole.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone.
Merci, bonjour tout le monde.
Not easy to get up after a lovely dinner last night and 1.5 busy days. But we thought after discussing the serious global issues, it will be good to focus on one country, a country which is a bright spot. It's not only one of the largest economies in the world, actually 5th largest economy, likely to become the 4th largest economy in the next few months, definitely the next year. Growing at 6.5% per year at the moment, according to IMF and the World Bank. And many people are predicting that it may become the 3rd largest economy in the world by year 2030. The debate in India these days is when it would become an advanced economy. So by 2047, as the Prime Minister is calling for it to become, or it will take longer period. So we thought it will be worthwhile to focus on India in our forum, and there's no better person to talk about it than Montek Ahluwalia. Most of you in the room know him. He, in my view, is not only a brilliant economist, but a perfect example of a policymaker. And he's not only held senior positions at the World Bank and IMF, but he's held many, many senior positions in the Indian government. But I think he's best known as the person who conceived the major economic reforms in India, which started in 1991, and thereafter held many senior positions in the government, including as chairman of the Indian Planning Commission for 10 years. So Montek, I know you're focusing these days on climate change issues, not only in India, but worldwide, and we had a great session yesterday. But tell us what you think about Indian economy long term, what it would take India to become an economy over the longer term. Paint for us a picture as India strives to become not only one of the largest economies in the world, but how the living standards of Indian people will rise. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Harinder. Always a pleasure to get the floor at the EMF. Because normally, as you said, we don't talk about an individual country, but I'm quite happy to talk about long-term prospects for India. You know, as you yourself have pointed out, the target that's been set by the Prime Minister is that we ought to aim at being an advanced economy by the year 2047. This, of course, has led to lots of people discussing what does it mean to be an advanced economy. But if you use the common metric of GDP, I mean, it's quite clear that implicit in that target is a pretty high growth rate of GDP. But that's not all. It's got to be inclusive. It's got to be not just inclusive in terms of income. It'll have to be more inclusive regionally, gender issues, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, the big challenge is, can India's GDP grow at a rate which is roughly commensurate with becoming something like the bottom of what is called the high-income group? And most people think that that will require a growth rate of 8%. Some people think even 7.5%. Remember that population growth is slowing down in India quite a bit. So what at one stage would have required 9% can be achieved at a lower growth rate in terms of per capita income because population is not growing. So let's just say 7.5% to 8%. So one issue, obvious issue is, I mean, is India capable of growing at that rate? The positive side of that is that in the recent past, there have been periods when the Indian economy looked like getting into that category. It certainly did that between 2004 and 2010, or even 2011. Slowed down after that, picked up again, hit by COVID. So it's a patchy record, but over the longer term, right now, the IMF and various other people project that having recovered from COVID, and I think the economy has more or less recovered from COVID, the economy will grow at about 6.2, 6.3% in the next 2 or 3 years. Now that's distinctly lower than the target, but the target is a 20 or 25-year target. You know, if you believe that the economy is capable of growing at 6.3, and you set a target of 7.5 or even 8, that is clearly going to require something extra, but not such a huge change that you would rule it out to begin with. So the question then is, what does it require that's extra? Well, I mean, I think clearly some of the obvious things, the investment rate has got to go up. It had gone up to about 35%. The fact that it had gone up to 35 for a few years makes a lot of people feel that if we get to the past, it's more open to foreign investment, and indeed foreign investment being actively welcomed. And if there is an interest in FDI coming in, I think they'll find the Indian government very willing to welcome it. And we've had many examples of major companies announcing their intentions to invest in India. And then there's a pretty large domestic investment capacity. India has a very diverse private sector. And interestingly, it's a private sector that's now also investing abroad. You know, sometimes in the domestic debate, the fact that the Indian private sector is investing abroad is kind of described as they're running away from India. I think that's a very narrow-minded kind of view. I mean, if you're running a big economy, we're not a rich economy, but we're sort of a big economy, and you have major private sector interests, it's a good thing that these guys are investing abroad. They're spreading their footprint beyond India. And all that is indicative of the fact that on the private investment front, the prospects need not be bad. The critical thing, though, is will the government be crowding out the private sector? And I think that is critical in India because, you know, we now have a combined deficit of the center and the state governments put together, which is around 9+% of GDP. Some would say 10. Now that is very, very high. And by any standard, if the intention is to have Indian growth led by the private sector and not led by the state, yesterday there was some reference to the fact that mood is changing around the world, governments are becoming more important. I think we're too early for that sort of change in mood. We need to make a really competitive private sector grow bigger and more aggressive. If that's to be done, then I have no doubt that the fiscal challenge is a major challenge. The central government and the state governments put together have to cut their own fiscal deficits by something like 5 percentage points of GDP, maybe over the next 3-4 year period. Now that's a huge, we won't go into it now, but it's quite clearly something that is going to require a major effort at tax mobilization, combined with getting rid of dysfunctional expenditures. Now, you know, economists love to describe certain expenditures as dysfunctional, but when you look into it, those are precisely the expenditures that the politicians like. So in a democratic environment, when you have to go back to the populace every now, to the electorate every now and then, the normal promises that are made are all kinds of programs, ostensibly, which are going to help the people at large, particularly the weaker sections of the people. So how India handles that is going to be very, very critical. Second, I mean, although we have grown in the past, we've got two new things that are happening which could make the future totally different. One is, of course, climate change. And climate change is, we will maybe be discussing it and have discussed it in other sessions. Everybody agrees that climate change is going to require a major structural change in many sectors, particularly the energy sector, certainly in the transport area, and actually also in agriculture. Because, you know, methane emissions from agriculture are huge. And if you're serious about getting to net zero by 2070, it will require a completely different way of doing Indian agriculture. And we've not actually been very successful in achieving structural change in agriculture. And I would say that's a weakness. In the sense, we've talked about it. We did a terrific job during the Green Revolution. I mean, the early fear that the Indians would never be able to feed themselves, that sort of receded. But to transform agriculture into a more modern agriculture means getting it away from government subsidies. And that is not just an economic thing, that's also a political thing. And unfortunately in India, too many in the farming community are wedded to a form of procurement and state fixation of prices, which are supposed to be productive, et cetera, and how we make that change is a big area to look at. You know, I think on other aspects of climate change, we will have to transform the energy sector, which also means that the pricing systems in the energy sector have to change. And that is, again, another politically heavily difficult thing to do, because people have got used to very low prices and very great unwillingness to let the market sort of determine. And yet, you know, if we're going to move into, for example, a much greater dependence on renewables, which is the policy in which we're actually beginning to make progress on, then the problem of intermittency is going to be a major thing. And if supplies are intermittent, then prices must adjust. So we need much greater sort of play of prices in things like time of day metering, intraday variation. We're just beginning to do that. So these will be huge challenges. I'm not trying to be negative. I'm just trying to identify the big areas where something needs to be done. I think another area that India will need to address is really what kind of a world are we moving into? We had a lot of discussions yesterday on the fact that geopolitical fragmentation is undermining what used to be a consensus about how the world is going to work, countries remaining open to trade, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you know, these things had picked up in the domestic debate. And whereas, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago in India, if you said that, listen, the way to go forward is to be open, integrate, et cetera, you suddenly hear people saying, oh, but that's yesterday's economics. Because, you know, Danny Roderick has said, no, there's nothing wrong with protection and industrial policy. Many of the sources of wisdom in the West, which actually peddle the open economy benefits, have completely changed. Actually, they've given us sort of, like in the automobile sector, they recall the earlier models and issuing new ones on the grounds that we were all wrong. Incredible damage is being done by what I think is utterly irresponsible action. For India, I'm not talking about all countries, I'm just talking about India. If you were to measure, are we open or closed to trade, the short answer is we're a lot more open than we used to be, which is good. But we're less open than our neighbors in East Asia. And to my mind, it's very clear. I mean, India ought to be integrating much more with East Asia and lowering our tariffs and remaining open. The problem there is, I think we're intellectually, Indian business is kind of willing to accept that, but they're not actually willing to compete with China. And here again, the global perception that China is an unfair competitor, I mean, the moment you say, no, you should compete with China, they will quote any number of US authorities saying China behaves unfairly, heavily subsidized, non-transparent, much of which, by the way, may be true. But nevertheless, I mean, we cannot seriously think of becoming a major country in Asia under the premise that we can't compete with China. And I think that has to change. But that's not easy to do. I take some comfort in the fact that the government, they have done some, in my view, regressive things, raising customs duties in a few areas. But you know, when the US is doing it, it's very difficult to get developing countries not to follow suit. They haven't done too much so far. The government has said they want to integrate with global supply chains, and that the issue has then come up that, look, if you want to integrate with global supply chains, then you must be, by and large, a very open economy. And I think how Indian policy will move in this direction is, at the moment, is not determinedly going to be rejected, but we have to see. But handling this is very crucial. And this is actually a debate in India that needs to be held much more openly. the simple proposition that we are more closed than other developing countries, and therefore we should lower our tariff barriers. This is something we need to debate more actively in India. I hope we do. But I think personally that in the way that India has done these reforms, they've always been slow and gradual, with a little bit of slippage here and there. So I don't rule out that, let's say in the next 10 years, I don't rule out a continued movement in the right direction. It won't be as dramatic as perhaps many would like, but I think it's possible. However, this is still an open question, because I've not seen a government pronouncement to the effect that although we see signs of protectionism around the world, we think we need to become more open. Now, the positive side of it is that we are negotiating free trade agreements with the UK. We've done something with Australia, the UK, and the EU. And you know, I mean, negotiators are very difficult to judge because they always say lots of progress has been made and you know, we're now at the last stages. But my guess is that if India does manage to get a free trade agreement done with the UK and with the EU, I think that will set a kind of set a direction in which future trade policy will also move in the right way. Those are some of the issues, but you know, at the end of it all, are we going to be able to accelerate growth to 7.5%? Who knows? But it's not, I think, impossible because we're talking about a 25-year period. Not, I mean, I don't expect anything to happen in the next year because this is an election year. So an election year is not a year in which governments sort of set the fiscal position right and make all sorts of other controversial changes. But looking beyond that, I think the willingness to take some of these tough decisions on the fiscal deficit, on trade policy, on energy pricing, these will determine whether we have a chance.
Thank you, Montek. Thank you very much. Very thoughtful comments. Some hopeful signs. I think the basic message I take is that India needs to be more open.
That's my message.
Yes.
Yes, that's my message.
No, exactly. And that's the debate I think the country needs to indulge in. Let's open up to questions. Bobby.
Thank you, Chairman. So Mai from Thailand.
Former Minister of Finance.
I've heard something very important from Montek. You said you would advise that India, a very big country, should be more open. Should be more open. No doubt about that. I agree with you. But what I would like to ask you now, what about Thailand? We are smaller, much smaller than India. What should be our policy on this aspect?
You mean, what would I advise Thailand to do as Thailand? No, I'm, if you're, for me, I think you should encourage us to be more open. I mean, what you said is absolutely right. I think India, let me say India should be more open, and I think we'll do well if we become more open. As a matter of fact, many people are making the point now that the change of policy that was introduced in India in the last 3 or 4 years, which made us less open, has been reflected in a poorer export performance. I mean, India's export performance was improving tremendously. It's now deteriorated. But people haven't yet worked out that this may be the result. I mean, many of these moves were done in order to prevent a flood of imports from swamping domestic industry. What people, I mean, we more than any other country should be aware that when you follow those policies, which we did in the 1970s, the net result is export performance collapses. Well, I mean, the evidence does suggest that exports are going down in the last 3 or 4 years. Of course, people say, oh, but you know, world trade was doing badly. But I'm talking about even as a share of world trade. We haven't collapsed, but we haven't been increasing. So I think we should be more open, that's very clear. Now, mind you, we have a free trade agreement with the ASEAN region. It's unfortunate, in my view, that we didn't join the RCEP. I mean, at one point, there was a hope that we would. But whether it was, the impression I have is that segments of Indian industry that were afraid of extending that openness, which they're quite willing to extend to East Asia, to Southeast Asia, extending it to China wasn't something that they were willing to do. But you know, the free trade agreement with the ASEAN has somehow, I mean, it says ASEAN is less interested in, because they're now into RCEP. We need to do something to increase trade with this region, there's no doubt. And in any case, you know, there's a lot of talk about sort of China plus one. I mean, global companies not wanting to concentrate all their options in China, I don't think they're going to give up on China. China is too important for that. But they will say, well, why not have China plus one? And the question is, who's that one going to be? Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, India. And people in India are saying that, listen, you know, in certain areas we may well be able to compete. Well, I think we would. But for that, we have to be competitive vis-a-vis these countries. So actually, the best thing that would happen in India is to make a comparison. So what is it that Thailand or Indonesia or Vietnam, or for that matter, Bangladesh offers, which an investor in India doesn't get? And to my mind, the government should just rectify that imbalance and correct it.
Portugal.
Montek, it was a pleasure to listen to you. I know that your focus is mostly on economics, but I'm a little curious to have your opinion about the impact of Hindu nationalism and of the question with Muslim populations within India. Will this not be, let's say, a factor that can hinder the economic future of India? Thanks. It's a curiosity, it's not an opinion. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I should confess that, you know, I use a hearing aid which isn't very effective when there's amplification of sound. So since I think you asked an important question, I'm just going to check with Harinder exactly what it was.
The question is about
yeah. I think, yesterday, I think the governor of the Banque de France, in what I thought was a brilliant address, raised this issue of the rise of nationalism and narrow nationalism across the world, and I think we are also experiencing that. You know, some of this in India could be the result of just a politicization by some parts of the party structure, politicization of the logical pursuit of decolonialization, so decolonializing your mind kind of thing. So, you know, that happens everywhere, and you do a little bit of rewriting of your history. But I mean, in a diverse country, if this degenerates into a sort of majoritarian neglect of the concerns of the minority, then it can be very dangerous. Now, you know, the government is not actually asserting this as a matter of policy, but it is true that the rise of nationalism very often leads to opinions being expressed, particularly in social media, 100% in social media, which are, you know, when you read them, and they're just really absurd. But what to do about it, to be honest with you, I just hope that our political system recognizes that it says, all our political leaders say, that India's diversity is one of the things that makes it unique, which is true. Also, that it's one of the things they're proud of. Now, I think if we are proud of it, we must preserve it. And here, diversity is not just between religious groups. The regional issues, in fact, if you made a list of what are the potential problem areas in India arising from diversity, there would be certainly problem areas between different religious groups. There would be problem areas between different regions. There would be problem areas within the majority across, caste hierarchies. And I mean, it is going to require quite a brilliant feat of social engineering to keep all this thing together. I just hope that, so far we've done quite well. And there are circumstances when a democratic environment living in a world of social media can get pushed in a certain direction because people don't realize the dangers that are being unleashed. I think it's too early to judge whether these will get corrected or not. I hope they will be. But frankly, there's no other alternative for India because managing the diversity has to be a first requirement for any successful economic strategy in India. And I think sensible people across the political spectrum realize that. So let's see how it goes.
Suma.
Thanks very much. Really enjoyed that, Montek, as always. I guess one comment would be whether the idea of India is possible without any national party anymore. There isn't a national party really as such. There are a lot of regional parties. Even the BJP is pretty regionalized, I would say. But that wasn't my question. My question really is actually, I think we all share your view that a more open economy, even more open than it currently is, would be a good thing. But for that to happen, some of those policies need to be consistently applied across political parties and across electoral cycles. I mean, one of the ones you mentioned yesterday, carbon tax, for example, if we ever go down that route. What hopes are there in some areas of policy that we could have cross-party agreement over the long term? I think particularly of energy, I think agricultural subsidies is pretty difficult to get agreement on because it's too dynamic as a political issue. But in the energy field, as you know, I'm on the board of Renew, so this is particularly interesting me. And related to that is a China +1 issue, where I do notice Indian companies setting up, trying to replace or at least compete with some Chinese entities, for example, in renewable energy with solar manufacturing and so on. Are those trends things we're going to likely see more of in the coming years?
Can you just clarify? Sorry, I'm asking Harinder because I want to be sure that I've got it right.
Is it possible to have long-term policies in some areas where different parties agree, for example, on energy?
Yeah. That's a tough, I don't want to give a glib answer. It's getting a lot tougher. Partly it's getting a lot tougher because we're no longer in the old world that I'm sure you and I enjoyed when political discourse was limited to a thin upper cream which contained people from different parties, but they also were very much the people like us kind of category, where each could talk to people on the other side. Again, the democratization of opinion through social media has really meant that this upper cream has become largely irrelevant. I think that's true in the West, it's true in the United States, probably true in UK, I don't know about Europe. And as a result, this upper cream is essentially looking to this upper cream of maybe 5%. In India, it may have been only 2%. Is looking to the next 35 or 40% or even 50%, most of whom really didn't have an opinion on most of these things. But now they have opinions, they're all very knowledgeable. They're all PhDs from the University of WhatsApp. There is no subject on which they don't have an opinion. and on which they feel they have a right to the opinion on the grounds that they've got all the facts that are necessary. Now, in that environment, whether it'll be easy, to be honest, I don't want to be glib, it's going to be very difficult. But I think that's really what leadership is about. I mean, I think the political leaders of the future are going to have to be people who can somehow get the message across to their own electorate and also look good internationally. And here, by the way, I mean, since internationally there's more of a sense of a shared sense of what is proper, maybe the combination of these two things will make a difference. You know, when you talk about national parties, I'm less concerned about whether you always have a national party. I mean, remember the 1991 reforms in India, which are widely regarded as a critical moment, a watershed moment, etc. They were brought in by a coalition government. So the fact is, if we are a diverse society, we shouldn't rule out the possibility that some form of sensible coalition of parties might be able to, as it were, capitalize on a broad consensus and then sell it to the public.
Thank you, Montek. Bobby?
Montek, in the past year, India was front and center in the entire international community because it was a leading country in BRICS and then took the leadership of G20. And in both cases, it seemed to me it was positioning to be able to be the leading nation of the South in promoting a multipolar world, to some extent to the consternation of those who would prefer a unipolar world. So my question is this positioning something that India is going to promote actively and therefore continue to assume that leadership position and therefore influence the thinking of the South? And to what extent do you think this is going to play out in terms of its being beneficial to the national interests of India?
Well, I'm not sure that I think we were ever... At a certain point, I think, when our economy wasn't particularly important, it's possible to talk about global trends delinked a little bit from what they would imply for the national interests. That was also possible because of a world of multilateral trade where every country benefited from everyone else, whatever national policies it followed. I think that's changed very substantially. And my guess is that, you know, India does not stand to benefit from the creation of a unipolar or even a bipolar world. So the idea that the world is multipolar and we need to play the game on the basis of the rules of a multipolar world would be a natural assumption to make in India. The difference, I think, is that whereas in the past we tended to regard any association with one or the other pole as somewhat a denigration of your independence, although we did become very dependent on the Soviet Union, but nevertheless we insisted that this is not affecting policy, etc. I mean, today, in all probability, we will be involved in multiple interactions, including with countries that belong to one part of the pole. I mean, for example, we joined the Quad, which is clearly on one side. We're not allies in the Quad, but we are what they call strategic partners. So there's a willingness to partner with countries where there is a common national interest involved. But I think how this this has to be anchored in an economic integration also. But I would hope that in India people would work out that it's not logical to conduct a foreign policy where you are defining a special interest in some countries and then not combine that with an economic policy that promotes economic integration. In that sense, I think as long as the Chinese system is as different as it is, the idea of economic integration with China will cause many people to have second thoughts. That's not saying trade. Trade is fine. But deeper economic integration, many countries will have doubts about. They don't have those doubts about the other countries. So I think our economic choices in some respects are broadened, but it's not a simple choice because I don't think India will want to see itself as simply joining one group, hook, line, and sinker. So how we manage that is an open question.
Thank you. Hassan? Hassan Talai.
Yeah, hi Montek. Thank you very much for these comments. One of the things that I recall, and perhaps my data are not up to date, is productivity was relatively low in India. So that, what is the thinking about undertaking the kind of reforms and changes that will allow you to get greater output, greater effectiveness out of 30% investment to GDP in lieu of jacking it up to 35, so you're not squeezing other sectors out? And that, to me, leads to a point. I mean, this was just a short chat, so you didn't have time to go into it. But it strikes me that to sustain the kind of innovation that will drive productivity, considerable attention will have to be devoted to building the human capital. I mean, you have the terrific schools at the top, but then there's a very big abyss that will not sustain the kind of openness to maybe in goods trades, but not in services. So, I mean, I think, what is the thinking on that? Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on the productivity dilemma that you're facing?
Well, there's no question in anyone's mind that we need to do a lot in the area of human capital. There's a certain reassurance that some of the policies that we've been following are leading to the development of technological capability of a high order in certain areas. I mean, the moon mission and all that kind of stuff, it does suggest that a certain amount of human capital is being developed. And many of these people who are responsible for it are not coming from our elite universities. I mean, when I was in the Planning Commission, I once visited the Indian Space Research Organization and wanted to meet a lot of the younger people there. And I was really surprised when I asked them, where are you from? And they all indicated they were from all sorts of regional colleges. So I asked the director of the Space Research Center that how come you don't have anybody from the IITs for which you're all famous? And they said, no, those guys go to McKinsey and JP Morgan. They don't pursue that technical side at all. So, I mean, this is an interesting point that, but it's not fair. The IITs are now doing quite a lot of mentoring and startups and things like that. So, I think India has evidence that on the one hand, the emphasis on human capital has led to the ability to do a whole lot of things which demonstrably put you at the front line of whatever technology is. And that's good because it makes people feel that if we can do that, well, we can multiply it, it's just a matter of scale, et cetera, et cetera. The second thing is on human capital is that it's not, and on this there's quite a lot of success, and that is the creation of a culture in which entrepreneurship and startups, et cetera, are encouraged. Now, I would say that in the last 10 years, progress in this dimension has perhaps been the most impressive. because a number of whatever, I mean, in India they call them unicorns if their whatever market cap reaches $1 billion. But you know, in order to be more optimistic than we legitimately can be, the ones that haven't reached $1 billion are called soonicorns. In other words, they're soon going to become unicorns. And that story is actually quite rich. And even I find, you know, traveling around in India, somebody comes up, if they recognize me, I ask them, what are you doing? I'm doing a startup. Now, you know, 15 years ago, a moderately successful fellow in business class would be saying, I'm working for JP Morgan, or I'm working for some multinational, whatever. Now you find a whole lot of guys who actually are doing their own startups. And I think linked to that is what the digitalization is doing to democratize the financial sector. I mean, the whole fintech revolution, people coming in, using a lot of data in order to improve the assessment of credit worthiness, allowing the banks to expand credit to people who normally would not be funded. Now, there's a lot of talk about, you know, doing this for the very bottom of the pyramid, which is also very important. But it's for this middle group that it makes a huge difference. But many of these people, they don't go to the banks or to the capital market. They go to these various types of fintechs and collect money one way or the other. So, you know, frankly, that sector shows a lot of oomph in India right now. And the problem, of course, is that, you know, you can have a market capitalization of over $1 billion and not be making much profit. So how much of that reflects real productivity as opposed to froth in the capital market? That's an open question. But, you know, underneath it all, I think, is a whole new layer of economic activity. And it's not just concentrated in Bangalore. It's not just, you know, call centers, which are a kind of outsourcing of a very simple service. It's a whole lot of people who are actually creating value within the economy and doing it in a pretty interesting kind of way. So I think human capital being molded in this direction is important. Where I think we're not doing a good job is actually more formal methods of skilling. I mean, the government institutions for developing skills, not very efficient. There are private institutions, but it's not clear that they're doing quite what they should be doing. And I think our corporate sector isn't doing enough skilling itself through internships and what have you. And I think this is an area where people are thinking about it, but I can't point to examples of huge success. But certainly, the next 20 years for India, there is no chance of getting to 7.5%, 8% growth without an improvement in human capital being a very important part of it. But you know, remember that the usual focus is on improving primary schooling, which is of course important. You know, functional literacy and numeracy. And we're not as good as we should be in that area. No question about it. I mean, we've successfully expanded the school system, but we don't seem to have a school system that's generating quality of output as much as it should. And that has to be a high priority. My guess is in that, you know, logically, this is not an all-India activity. This is really something that is controlled by individual states. So in that sense, you know, it's decentralized because schools are effectively controlled by state governments. Some states are very much more progressive than others. What would be interesting is if in the next 5 or 6 years, it becomes very clear which are the states that are doing well. And I think we do have mechanisms where success stories get spread. And to my mind, our various governmental systems at the central level ought to be making individual states more aware of who's doing better. And that's the best way of really improving practices.
Montek, thank you. We have only 5 minutes left, so let me ask you a very different question. You know, I all wish India great success. We hope, if not by 2047, maybe a few years later. Let me ask the question this way. Homi is not here. He was here, I think he stepped out. Work we did for you when you were in the Planning Commission, India 2039. Section, they're debating whether India will fall in the latest World Development Report is on the issue. Next month. And they went to China, by the way, to review whether China is likely to fall in the middle income trap and see what they say. And they're also looking at India. My concern, I hope India reaches 7.5%, 8% growth by following the type of policy reforms that you're mentioning. But my concern is a little bit reverse, whether the growth may fall below even 6%. Not immediately, but in the medium term. The reason is, as you know well, India's GDP is only 1/5 of China's today. Its per capita income is also about 1/5 of China's. And the hoopla associated with G20 and in my last few visits to India gives me a sense of a little bit of overconfidence that all is well. We are now the 5th largest economy in the world. We used to be 15th only 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And somehow the country is on autopilot. It will become the 3rd largest economy in the world very soon. Do you think I'm wrong about the overconfidence?
Well, you know, when you're organizing an international jamboree, to sort of object to overconfidence amongst the people organizing that jamboree is a little unfair. But to my mind, I don't think it's true that the problems are being minimized. Actually, even the finance minister herself recently said, well, you know, you can't take 7% for granted. So this point is well established. In the academic community, you know, I think my good friend Venu Reddy once coined this lovely aphorism. He said, the future is always uncertain, but in India, even the past is uncertain because we keep questioning our data and so on. And, you know, if you want alternative views on India, I would just recommend to you the books of 2 of your very good friends. Ashoka Modi, who has the benefit of a long academic experience and work in the World Bank, who has trashed...
IMF.
Also, IMF, yeah, IMF, okay.
Also World Bank.
Also, okay, well, so much the better. Who has simply trashed India's prospects. I think it's an absurdly negative. I mean, he's rightly pointing out that our performance in certain areas is weak, but he's simply trashing the whole thing. And you can read the stuff written by Sujit Bhalla, another of your and my very good friends, who actually takes an exactly opposite view. So I think policy makers are always aware that there are fellows who paint a rosy picture. And, you know, in a way, if you look at what the IMF is very good at this nowadays because they never make a projection without a fan of possibilities. And quite frankly, the upper end of that fan is really terrific, and the lower end of that fan is terrible, but everybody focuses on the median. So, yeah, I mean, my guess is that, if India fails to do these things, and most importantly, fails to get the macroeconomic correction that I talked about, we might get stuck at around 5% or so, maybe 5%. I don't think we would ever make the sort of mistakes that would lead to less than that, okay? A half-baked performance, maybe 6.5. A really good performance, taking care of 5 or 6 major issues, I think India could, for an extended period, hope to do better than 7. That, of course, assumes that the world is not going to implode. I mean, it's going through a very difficult period, but we assume that, the countries will get out of it. And remember, as far as world trade is concerned, the future of global climate depends crucially on industrialized countries slowing down. I mean, they have reached a level of income where, quite frankly, the old idea that the South cannot grow unless the industrialized countries grow should be given up. Because I don't think that the world, the planet can sustain high growth in the West and high growth in the South. But if industrialized countries are going to slow down, and most people think they are, and demography alone will push for that slowdown, then the growth in the rest of the world is going to be the growth of Asia and other developing countries, right? So India doesn't have to be competing all the time with industrialized countries. It will be participating with industrialized countries and competing for expanding markets in Asia. Now, a lot depends on whether Asia remains open, and I think to its credit, it has remained open. I think India is lagging in that, and at home, that's what I point out. That let's try to be as open as ASEAN. I mean, after all, in terms of absolute size, ASEAN is actually less in population, maybe about the same in GDP. So it makes sense for India to say, well, look, can we, on the trade front, can we integrate in the same way that these countries are integrating? On the domestic front, certainly human capital, certainly the macroeconomic imbalances, because, the ability to develop both human capital and to tackle the climate crisis, because whatever may happen in the G20, I don't expect vast sums of money to come to finance it from the West. That is a huge challenge. I think there's also a the softer side of integration, that we need to frankly look at a lot of our procedures and just compare them with the rest of the world. And if we make a list of 150 procedures in India, and if whoever is running the government after the next election simply says, could you give me a benchmark of what other countries are doing, and we took the general decision that in 2/3 of these we should reach the international benchmark, we'd be doing quite well. I mean, there's a lot. What happened in 1991 showed that if you get rid of dysfunctional controls, then the possibilities of the system get unleashed. And to my mind, the problem in India will really be that it's not going to be easy to ensure inter-regional equality. And already we are seeing that. Of course, you can mitigate these problems by migration, and that's also happening. And people from the north migrate to the south, which is actually attracting most of the investment. This creates another set of problems because it alters the politics of these countries as in-migration comes. So, the nice thing about economics and society and politics is there's no dearth of problems. But the name of the game is to get on to the next range of problems. And as you say about the middle income trap, we're at the bottom of the middle income. So we're just going to find out what the middle income trap really means. If Indermeet Gill is organizing a World Development Report on the middle income trap, I strongly advise that the next meeting of the EMF, we should dissect that report and hopefully learn from it and maybe teach the bank a thing or two, which they may or may not have picked up.
Good. I'm talking to him on that.
Good.
On that note, Montek, thank you very much. This is brilliant, as expected. And thank him, please, and then coffee break.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now take a 10-minute coffee break in the foyer. We will reconvene in this auditorium at 10 a.m. sharp.